All right, thank you. Hi everyone, I'm Sunyup. I am a PhD candidate at the University of Maryland College Park, and I'll be presenting on behalf of our team where we investigated how short-term rental hosts use smart home devices. So more and more short-term rental hosts are using smart home devices to manage their properties, and this is concerning for guests' privacy because in short-term rentals they expect greater privacy because these short-term rentals provide a feeling of home. So when we look into literature, a majority of the work focuses on guests' privacy concerns and wants and needs. These three papers are most relatable to our research, but what we still don't know is hosts' practices on using these devices. So we ask these three research questions. How do short-term rental hosts use smart home devices in their rental property? How do they manage them? And also, how do they disclose and communicate them to guests? We conducted online interviews with 15 short-term rental hosts. Most of our participants hosted on Airbnb, and a few of our participants hosted on Vrbo. Most of our participants used smart home devices, and a few of our participants wanted to use these devices. Here I map our research questions to our interview protocol and data analysis. So in terms of our first research question on how hosts use smart home devices, we ask about their motivations, and we map our data analysis to codes such as types and location of these devices. In terms of our second research questions on management, we ask hosts about their management practices and map our data analysis to codes such as access and control. For our last research question on how hosts disclose and communicate their devices to guests, we ask about their perceptions and practices of disclosing their devices and map our data analysis with codes such as must disclose or unsure of disclosing. So we found that our participants use a variety of devices in a variety of places. This is some of the most frequently used devices by our participants. And if you see in terms of location, it has some privacy implications. So for example, smart speakers are used throughout the property. Smart cameras were mostly used in public access areas, for example, the front and backyard. But since our study was conducted before the Airbnb update to ban indoor cameras, some of our participants did use smart cameras indoors, like in living rooms, kitchen areas, or hallways. In line with previous literature, our participants did use these devices for security and safety purposes. So for example, P4 talks about how they check the number of guests coming in. When using smart cameras, our participants were thinking of guests' privacy, especially in terms of where to place them. Smart speakers were quite debatable among our participants, so some of our participants thought it was a privacy-invasive device and didn't want to use them, as opposed to some participants were okay with it and used it throughout their property. In terms of how our participants manage their smart home devices and data, half of our participants used their own accounts to manage these devices, but they also shared this account with property managers such as cleaners and neighbors, which means that they also have access and control of these devices. During guest stay, our participants set up guest modes and tried to limit their control of the devices. Our participants also set up notifications and sometimes relied on their gut feelings to monitor guests' activity. So for example, P10 talks about how they monitor guests' ins and outs using these devices. P11 talks about how she checked on a guest because she thought that there was something fishy going on. So we asked hosts about their opinions about platforms, guidelines, and policies regarding smart devices. For hosts who are familiar with these devices, they knew it through when they were editing or listing their property. So for example, P1 talks about how when he was editing his listing, he knew that there were fields that were incomplete and added information about his cameras. Our participants had mixed opinions about the guidelines that the platforms provided, mostly being positive. So for example, one participant said that it creates a norm for hosts to disclose these devices. Participants also talk about how it's a protection for both host and guests. There are some negative comments though. Some participants thought that the guideline was too generic, or maybe there were unclear definitions, so it was confusing. But overall, our participants wanted the platforms to actually better implement these guidelines, especially if they're putting the effort to disclose their devices. They really wanted guests to actually check them and acknowledge it. Most of our participants thought that they must disclose cameras, especially if they're indoors, but then they were unsure about other devices other than cameras. And our participants disclosed their devices in their listing descriptions, and some even disclosed it in multiple places, for example, messaging the guest or even placing a physical manual. Our participants experienced, if not anticipated, conflicts with guests when using these devices in their property. Some of our participants actually experienced conflicts with guests, and these usually involve the usage of cameras, whether it being outdoors or indoors. Most of our participants did not experience conflicts, but they could anticipate experiencing it later on. So in terms of resolving conflicts with guests, our participants were willing to accommodate guests' privacy under certain factors. So for example, their duration of stay, reasons for their concerns, and acknowledgement of the consequences. So for example, P12 talks about how the longer the stay, they build trust with the guest, so they might be more willing to negotiate the usage of cameras. We were pretty surprised that our participants were willing to negotiate a wide range of devices, from smart speakers, cameras, to smart TVs, and so on. Based on our findings, what we identify is a lack of guidance for hosts to navigate their conflicting needs. So our hosts had a conflicting need of wanting to protect their privacy versus wanting to protect guests' privacy. So for example, especially in terms of using cameras, our participants use cameras to monitor the property, but this inevitably monitored guests' activity. And in our paper, we point out some concerning usages of smart cameras in short-term rentals, for example, placing them indoors, or monitoring guests' activity, and in general, just lack of data management, for example, reviewing or deleting data rarely or never happened. And we identify this problem rooting from the cause that hosts don't actually have any guidance on how to navigate this conflicting needs. But we do feel hopeful because we did find that hosts actually care about guests' privacy. For example, the device choice and where to put them, logging out of guests' accounts if they left it, limiting control during their visit, also disclosing cameras, and so on. So in our paper, we talk about improving guidelines and provide some design recommendations and open up questions. So in general, there's a lack of guideline on how to manage data generated by these devices. In fact, Vrbo has some language pertaining to this, and we argue in our paper that Airbnb, as the most popular short-term platform, should adopt these languages. So for example, reasonable measures should be taken to limit access to the data that's been generated. And based on our study, we provide some more further guidelines and details. For example, we found that hosts share accounts with property managers, so there should be some guidelines when they do this. Also, Vrbo has a guideline about how data should be deleted when no longer needed. This is kind of ambiguous. So based on our findings, we can recommend that maybe hosts can delete data after guests' complaint period ends, so they can meet their need of trying to prove their business and also trying to protect guests' privacy. We have some design recommendations for the platforms. So we think that the platforms could provide periodic checkings for any updates on smart devices, as short-term rental hosts can easily add or remove the devices in their properties. And especially because our participants argued that this is a collaborative effort between hosts and guests, We recommend platforms to implement some design functions and features for guests to actually find information about smart devices. So we can think about filter functions for guests to actually search for their preferences, whether or not to have cameras or speakers in their properties when they're booking. Last but not least, we want to say that disclosure should be throughout the booking process, not just in the beginning. So not only putting in the property description, listings, but also messaging the host proactively, talking about what devices are there and what they're trying to do with it. And we have some open questions for the community. There's a lot of emphasis on cameras in the guidelines or people talking about it, but actually guests also find speakers privacy invasive. In our study, hosts were kind of ambivalent about it, so maybe we need more discussion about speakers, whether or not they're privacy invasive devices, and if so, how should we use them in short-term rental properties? And I also have to say, we did not even start talking about multi-functioning devices. So for example, smart displays or smart speakers with screens and cameras on it. Smart TVs now had embedded audio in the remote control or even have cameras embedded in them. So when we think about the growth of smart home devices and popularity, there's so much more we can talk about and think about. So thank you for listening to my talk, and I'll be happy to answer questions. I thank our participants for sharing their experiences with us. Thank you.